Garcia here for Psych 4450 Community Psychology, and this is our screen recording for Chapter 9, Law, Crime, and Community. So before we start looking at community psychology and the research and understanding laws and crimes and how they exist in the community, we do have to pay attention to our actual basic definition of crime. So crime is any intentional act that violates any criminal law in which a person has absolutely no legal excuse can be applied. There also needs to be a state with power. As you know, the United States, every state has power to not only create the laws or codify the laws, but also enforce the penalties of the laws as well. Now, when it comes to crime and criminals and understanding community contexts and neighborhoods, we know that there are specific ecological variables. So there's really 4 different areas that we need to be concerned about that the research over and over again starts to identify as why we have crime, high rates of crime, and criminal offenders in certain communities and maybe not so much in others. So first of all, there's ecological variables. Those ecological variables include things as number 1 is guns. It's an interesting fact. I know that there's a lot of discussion on gun laws, on whether, we should have stricter gun laws. But really over and over again in most of the research that's conducted by social scientists, not just psychologists, but by sociologists, criminal justice folks, psychologists, multicultural psychologists, right? There's a lot of different groups of people, even anthropologists are trying to understand culture. And the social science research tells us that when you have access to a gun as a resource, then this increases the intent of crime and criminal behavior. Other ecological variables are exposure to violence, whether it may be abuse that a person may have experienced within their family households, or even exposure to violence through media. There are some specific community characteristics. So this is the second area that we're interested in looking at. Our community characteristics where we see crime start to increase is when there's a community that is generally somewhat disordered and disorganized, has some instability, and really lacking in supportive community institutions. So where families and parents and children maybe don't have good, parks and recreation systems with youth activities after school, or even schools that have, open and welcoming centers where kids can stay at after school. And so unemployment rates also play a role, and general poverty or low socioeconomic status can play a role in crime and criminal offenders as well. Parenting behaviors certainly play a role. This is the third area where we know that can increase crime and criminal behaviors. When you have parents who have executed abusive situations to their children, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect, then these are areas where we see that these children grow up as youth with very harmful psychological damage and then engage in crime and criminal offenses. Now, once a person engages in crime and criminal offenses, then as of now, one of the things that we have is incarceration. Now, incarceration can be either in a jail system or a prison system at a city level, a county level, a state level, or a federal level, depending on where a person lives and what part of the cities or even the states that they live in. But overall, in the United States, our prison systems are in pretty bad shape. We have the highest incarceration rate compared to any other country in the world. When we have this, we think, because our prison systems are based on retribution, so vindication and retribution, and this is a traditional approach, and we haven't figured out how to use these prison systems or jails, again at state, federal, city, or county levels, to really help to rehabilitate individuals. Even though we think we have rehabilitation programs in our prison systems and jails, we still have very, very high recidivism rates. Recidivism is a person's return to engaging in crime and criminal behavior again. Now, we know another issue with incarceration in prisons in the United States is that we have overrepresentation of one group over the other. We will be exploring this in class when we start looking at the high school to prison pipeline. There are some high schools, some communities, and certain groups, and I mean groups within a BIPOC community, racial and ethnic, Black and brown folks, have more of a risk of having a pipeline to prison from specific high school systems and settings. A lot of this overrepresentation does occur because of stereotypical beliefs and all of the different isms that can engage as well. And of course, community. If a community lacks even, opportunities, if it lacks resources and services and support and a sense of cohesion and bonding, then it certainly is going to play a role in how a person might experience the community and increase incarceration. Prison systems, another issue is overcrowding. When you have an overcrowded system, you're going to have a negative and detrimental effects. One of the things most recently are the COVID-19 outbreaks and deaths as well. There's at higher rates of substance abuse and sexual violence in prisons where there's overcrowding compared to prisons where there is less in the population. The last issue that has to be discussed and addressed is within our prison systems in the United States, we have privatization. In other words, many of the prisons are owned privately, and those people are invested in making sure that the prisons stay open and that there's enough prisoners or people to fill the beds within the prison systems, because the private prison systems get funding from, depending on what type they are, a state, federal, or county institution. So they have a vested interest in making sure that the prison system is well full with as many people as they can. And that's where some of the overcrowding comes into place too. It goes down to money, greed, and financial investments for certain groups of people who have an ownership into the prison systems. Now, this is really problematic because those who own the prison systems have a very strong pull in politics. They hire what they call lobbyists, who lobby for specific laws to maintain their prisons to stay open and privatized. They also lobby for what we call flexible laws, which can be laws that can be interpreted with bias and where there are loopholes, and people can have more likely to be convicted of a crime with some laws other than over others. So this is another interesting dynamic. Now, I mentioned that the U.S. prison institutions are in a terrible state, and really what we know is, yes, the U.S. has the highest incarceration rate in the world, right? El Salvador is second, and Russia is third as far as the number of those in prison and in the prison population. I'm mentioning recidivism again, where a person would re-engage in the act of some type of criminal offense again. And so a lot of this happens from one, socialization, and I want to focus on that. So when you're in a prison system or in a jail system, there's a certain socialized behaviors. There's expectations on how you engage in that system, how you navigate that system, how you get along in the system. So it's important to know that there's a specific culture and vibe within the jail and prison systems in which people are learning to be socialized. And we also know that there have been some alternative approaches to try to minimize people coming in and out of prison systems, again, where they learn how to navigate the systems as well as know how to be socialized within the systems to know how to benefit themselves. There have been some alternatives such as boot camp. However, the boot camp data and research looking at this as an alternative going directly into the prison system is not very encouraging. So please know that the prison system itself is an environment that facilitates recidivism, because within that system there's a lot of violation of laws. There isn't really rehabilitation happening, and appears that there's more punishment than anything else. Now, when it comes to victims and victimization, let's talk about victims and fear of being victimized. Now, we do know that U.S. citizens experience to millions of crime each year. There's exposure to millions of crimes each year. Now, you can be a primary victim where you've had actually been experienced it itself. And you can also be a person is a secondary victim where you've witnessed maybe an immediate friend, a best friend, a partner, a family member, a parent, a child, a spouse, a partner, whatever it might be, has experienced that crime. So we have primary victims and secondary victims as well. Now we know that, this is interesting, the number of criminal offenses or crime that happens in the United States is less than our perceptions. Most people believe the crime rates are much higher than what they really are. So there's this interesting paradox that somewhat goes along with this as well. It's called the fear victimization paradox. The fear victimization paradox is this: those that are most fearful of crime are least likely to be victimized. And those that are least fearful of crime are most likely to be victimized. So this is an interesting dynamic as well that happens. Also, the perception of lack of safety is also shaped by your community. Your community, again, resources, the support networks, whether your community has a sense of disintegration, businesses closing down, homes, families, schools, neighborhoods, not having all the resources and the support that one could have. There are factors that can reduce the person's fear of victimization, and I wanted to focus on the first three here, which really comes back to community psychology and a lot we discuss, which is the attachment to one's neighborhood. How connected, what is that sense of belonging do you have to that neighborhood? Community cohesion is also important. Not just connection, that's one thing. A sense of belonging and connection is one thing, but really a sense of cohesiveness where all people feel unified, cohesive, unified together. And all of this, right, your attachment to your neighborhood, as well as how well unified you feel with other members in your community, really has a lot to do with the availability of support networks. So again, if your community has access to resources, good support networks, activities for adults, older adults, parents with young children, high school students, adolescents, right? The more support systems and structures and programs that you have in place, then the more sense of cohesion that you have and unity in that community, and again, a stronger sense of belonging and attachment to the neighborhood. And these are factors that do reduce the fear of victimization. Now let's talk a little bit about enforcement agencies. There's three different areas here. Community citizens we have to talk about when it comes to enforcing agencies. They themselves are not police officers, but community citizens do play a role in this because members hold mixed views of the police. Some hold very positive views, some hold very negative views. And with that, policing a community can be very difficult, not really knowing sort of which approach to take on. There's different criminal justice theories on the best approaches, but those approaches should also take into consideration, regardless of the approach, model, or theory that's being identified within criminal justice, we know that it all comes back to community and citizens and residents. But of course, many hold mixed views. Some have positive, some has negative views. Police and citizens also have different views as well. Not only do citizens or residents themselves have negative views, but police officers and citizens hold very different views of what police involvement means and should mean to that community. So when it comes to enforcement agencies, there's three different sort of methods or typical ways that a police agency could engage. Number one is active enforcement, where you have police presence and action throughout the community and throughout the day. Then you have a hotspot policing action as well, which is really targeting high-risk areas. In the city of Los Angeles, although there is active enforcement, really hotspots is one of the methods that is used, and where there are going to be cars out on patrol that are going to be targeting high-risk areas. Now, community policing is seen as one of the most effective method of policing, which is there's a collaboration between the police community as well as the residents of the community, where there is interaction and engagement at a neighborhood level. There's interaction and engagement in supporting laws and decision making, right? That there's a commission of residents who work closely with the police department to help them provide them with insight and understanding on how the residents want to be maybe treated or respected, and really an oversight community as well. The city of Los Angeles has a police commission, and that police commission is made up, and those commissioners are made up of citizens. They're made up of residents of the city of Los Angeles. And not only do they collaborate and work closely with the police chief and other members within the police department in the city of Los Angeles, but they also can be given reviews, be expected to review any violations of law that may have happened by law enforcement individuals. So if they're not a judicial system, they're not a jury, but if a person does take a case to court and say, this police officer violated my rights, a police commission can go ahead and review and evaluate that and be part of the investigative procedures as well. Now, when we have to address justice system issues within the context of community psychology, there are three different things we look at: primary prevention, secondary prevention, and tertiary prevention. Now, primary prevention is really working with individuals at risk. Since we acknowledge that recidivism rates are high, what is very important is to work with at-risk youth or maybe young adults to provide support to them within community systems. We have school-based programs, community-based programs, and ultimately what we find to be very effective is mentoring. Mentoring has incredibly positive effects to help youth withstand the negative influences that may occur within their family systems or their communities that put them at risk for crime and criminal behavior. So mentoring, we know, helps deal with stress, helps them build positive relationships, provides a role model, someone they can look up to. And also these mentoring programs don't have to be formal. They could be very informal because we know that they occur naturally within an extended family or even neighbors. Another framework of primary prevention is how we design our environments. Physically redesigning of schools, communities, blocks, businesses, homes, right? Some of these things are putting in things like burglar alarms, metal detectors at schools, or maybe even these video ring systems, right, that we have to help prevent crime, but they don't fully prevent the crime. But what's also important designing an environment, right, is to create a sense of attachment. Remember, when a community member has a sense of attachment or sense of belonging to the community, they are less likely going to engage in criminal offenses against that community. So this is very important, where people need to have a shared obligation to the community and wants what's best for it. Jane Jacobs is an important leader. She was an urbanist and an activist whose writings really championed a fresh community-based approach to city building, that we had to think about people and communities and older adults and families and parents and youth and children and adolescents, right, and teenagers. We needed to think about them first before we started to think about skyscrapers, high rises, and buildings, right? It's really important to think about the people first and how they navigate. For an example, Jane Jacobs said, the sidewalk is a very important thing in a community. If a sidewalk feels safe, if a sidewalk, has plants and benches and landscaping and people can feel safe there, right? Then a sidewalk should be a place where there's safety, where there's contact with other people, where, there's interaction, and where people are going to be on the street walking, talking, playing, sitting, watching, and even maybe working. This all makes for a viable and safe street. So Jane Jacobs was really a strong leader in looking at how urban communities should be designed and developed to build that sense of obligation to the community and sense of attachment to the community and its members. Primary prevention is also neighborhood involvement and perceptions as well. It's really based on community activity. Again, that sense of ownership, attachment, and empowerment. So, right, the perception that people have of their neighborhoods is really based on that, how connected they feel to it. Neighborhood crime watch programs are also important, and then, of course, community policing. What is the design of it? The design of community policing has to be taken into consideration with other residents and members in the community. It cannot be a police department deciding what community policing is going to be. It should be the police department collaborating, connecting with others in the community as well. Secondary prevention. So when it comes to secondary prevention, we're talking about early assistance for crime victims. Primary prevention is just prevention. Programs, services, networks, designs, implementation, how we should all be collaborating, working together. Secondary prevention is typically the crime has already occurred, but we need to figure out to provide some assistance for crime victims to improve their quality of life and to improve the community. So crisis intervention has to be applied. There are compensation programs. The state of California has a compensation program for individuals who've been victims of violence and restorative justice programs. So crisis intervention programs are really procedures used by trained individuals to help someone recover from the effects of the extreme stress of being a victim of violence. Therapists, MFTs, masters, MSWs, clinical psychologists, all these folks can work in trauma therapy to help victims. Restorative justice programs is really a justice system method for making right the wrong that was done. And it really should be inclusive of all members coming together within the community, right? And have mediation centers where victims and offenders mediate with each other. And that's a framework of restorative justice programs. Now, we also know that reintegration for incarcerated individuals is very, very important with pre-release programs. Like before you get released, you need to have counseling. You need to make sure you have adequate family support, that you have a social worker who's looking at education programs and maybe, providing group and community systems of support that can reduce recidivism rates. But of course, we know that more research needs to be done on these programs. Now, the tertiary prevention, again, going back to reintegration, we need to make sure that people have access to good networks, support systems, and social programs and services to reintegrate in a healthy way without relying on crime and criminalistic behavior. Voting rights is very important. If you're a felon in a state prison, a federal prison, or county jail, or other correctional facility, you have the right to vote once you finish and serving your term. Those that do have a right to even register are people who have not committed a felony. So like perhaps a misdemeanor and you're in a local city or county jail. Not only do you have the right to register, but you also have the right to vote. Of course, education is very important. Right here on our own campus, we have a couple of different programs that help to educate those that are in prison systems. We have we have actually faculty members that go to certain prisons and they actually provide them with college education courses. And not only do they may not get out of prison, but they can actually graduate with a bachelor's degree. Education is also important after a person is released from prison. And our campus, our other program is Project Rebound. Project Rebound is designed for people who have recently been in prison or jail and give them an opportunity to engage in the community at a college level. And then, of course, family community supports is a tertiary prevention program as well. This is, in other words, what do we need to do at the very end? A person has offended, they're criminal offenders, they've been in jail and prisons. What can we do to continue to prevent the next crime from happening? Reintegration appropriately with good services, making sure people feel empowered by having certain voting rights. Education is important within this jail system and prison systems, immediately after the jail and prison systems if there's opportunity as well. It doesn't have to be formal education training at a university. It could also be technical training or training for some type of skill set, and of course, family and community support. In conclusion, the justice system itself is a complex system and there's many, many players. And when we say players, we mean the prisons themselves, the jail system, the victims, enforcement agencies. Enforcement agencies include police officers, judges, lawyers. These are all part of the enforcement agencies, as well as community citizens and other groups. And only concerted and coordinated efforts will prevent or reduce crime in communities. So we have to take this on as a very serious project and really engage with really important answers. And really, finally, more research and attention to this system, not only the prison systems, but the justice system is needed by community psychologists, because it's the community where people are going to grow and develop and foster a sense of unity and cohesion and a sense of belonging, where we know if you have those kind of vibes within your community, you're going to be less likely to commit a crime in your community. That's it. That ends our chapter on law, crime, and community.